Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. This week was a very busy one for news. We had Trump giving his State of the Union speech, followed the next day by his acquittal in the impeachment trial. And also this week, the Democrats made quite a mess of the Iowa caucuses. And to help us get a perspective on these events, I'm joined by historian Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy is the author of 4 books on U.S. foreign policy, and he has taught at numerous universities in the field of U.S. history and foreign relations, and contributes to a number of progressive publications. And he's a board member of the Tulsa Peace Fellowship and on the steering committee for Historians for Peace and Democracy. So welcome back to Wider View, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me.
So I thought we'd begin with the State of the Union speech, which I think might be better described as the opening speech of the Trump 2020 campaign. And, I thought we might begin where he began, which is with the economy. Now, I have a little clip here that I'll play, which hopefully you can hear, and then we can talk a little about it.
Our agenda is relentlessly pro-worker, pro-family, pro-growth, and most of all, pro-American. We are advancing with unbridled optimism and lifting our citizens of every race, color, religion, and creed very, very high. Since my election, we have created 7 million new jobs, 5 million more than government experts projected during the previous administration. The unemployment rate is the lowest in over half a century. And very incredibly, the average unemployment rate under my administration is lower than any administration in the history of our country.
Well, see, he didn't get very far in. He's already invoking history, Jeremy. So what's your take on this economy situation? What are you saying about the economy?
Well, I think it's very misleading because the unemployment rate, according to various studies, focuses on employed workers and those who are actively seeking work. So there's millions of people who've dropped out of the workforce and who are homeless, who are not counted as part of the unemployment rate. And there are also many, many people who are underemployed, who are not making ends meet. They could be among the homeless. People who are forced to work part-time jobs that don't pay a living wage, don't have benefits with those jobs, and are a very, very precarious situation. And that includes now a lot of people in higher education who are forced to work as adjuncts. So I don't think the economy is as good as Trump is suggesting. The stock market has gone up in part because of tax cuts pushed by Bush, Obama, and Trump. But that doesn't mean that the economy is healthy or balanced overall. I mean, we've seen that, in the 1920s, the stock market was booming, but there was an underlying rot in the economy because of huge inequality that resulted in the Great Depression. So, and the stock market eventually crashing. So, I think we have to be very leery about this optimism. And Trump wants to claim credit for any economic success, but the president doesn't necessarily control the economy. And he can take measures to improve it and also to help disenfranchised groups. But Trump is doing the opposite. He's cutting budgets, for programs that will help working people and people who are struggling. He's lowering the tax rate for corporations, and public services are being gutted everywhere. And the education system, they're trying to move towards a privatized charter school system. They're also admitting that public schools have failed. And that they can only save a few kids, in these charter schools. There's no commitment to investing in public education for everyone. So I think one has to be very leery about Trump's message and, see through the rhetoric.
Yeah. No, I think with the education situation is very typical. It's a standard plan, a neoliberal plan. We underfund things for years, and we cut back on support for them, and then all of a sudden, they're failing, and so it's the government's fault. The government can't run anything, so we have to replace it with private schools.
Exactly. Very well said. Yeah.
Since we're on that topic of evil government, here's another little clip.
And we will always protect your Medicare, and we will always protect your Social Security, always. But as we work to improve Americans' health care, there are those who want to take away your health care, take away your doctor, and abolish private insurance entirely. 132 lawmakers in this room have endorsed legislation to impose a socialist takeover of our health care system, wiping out the private health insurance plans of 180 million very happy Americans. To those watching at home tonight, I want you to know we will never let socialism destroy American health care.
So, any thoughts?
I mean, I guess for years, right-wing elements have been promoting that narrative, and that would go over well, in the 1950s, and with groups like John Birch Society, which may be Trump's lineage. I think you can ask Canadians what they think about, socialized medicine, and I think most Canadians will tell you that they're very happy to have a free healthcare system, and that, a wealthy country like the United States, it's really a shame that they can't provide free healthcare for all their citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is, and it goes back to what you were really saying earlier about the cutbacks in various social programs, and the other thing about the unemployment thing that I don't think we really discussed is what kind of employment are we discussing? He's claiming that the number of new jobs has increased dramatically in so many different groups, but then we have to think about what those jobs are paying, right, relative to the costs of living.
Absolutely, yeah. I think real wages, have been stagnated for decades, under this, neoliberal era, and the minimum wage has not gone up. And there's been a battle now to increase the minimum wage, which the minimum wage is scandalously low. And there have been studies, like I read a book years ago by Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickel and Dime. What it was like somebody in low wage work. And they just couldn't, she couldn't get by, even she had 2 or 3 jobs, and with all the bills to pay, it required having like 3 jobs, I guess. So she had no free time, and the conservatives are emphasizing family values for years, but if somebody has to work 3 jobs, they have no time to spend with their family. So what kind of economy is that? I mean, it's really an unfair economy that's been set up for decades, and Trump just represents the extreme right-wing program that really benefits the top 1%.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, his talk about always protecting Medicare and Social Security has to be seen against news we've seen very recently about Republican efforts to cut both. To cut the funding for both.
Yeah, and they never want to cut they never talk about the military budget. I mean, conservatives are interested in fiscal responsibility, at least in theory, which is a noble idea, but they never want to address the fact that a lot of America's fiscal problems comes from huge military spending, and Trump has caused a major, expanded the budgetary deficit considerably. So he's not a real conservative at all, because these tax cuts, combined with huge military spending, is a big factor for the expanded deficit. So I don't know what model of governance he's governing on, but it's not conservative.
Oh, no, it's not. In fact, I've got a little clip of his military spending, and some of it, and some of the things he's spending it on. Let's take a quick listen.
To safeguard American liberty, we have invested a record-breaking $2.2 trillion in the United States military. And just weeks ago, for the first time since President Truman established the Air Force, more than 70 years earlier, we created a brand new branch of the United States Armed Forces. It's called the Space Force.
As if we weren't spending enough money already.
Exactly. And we have no real enemy. That's why they have to create the Russian enemy. I mean, out of nothing. The Russian government was very friendly towards the United States after 9/11. It was the first government to call the United States and offer sympathy. But, I mean, the U.S. has just created, and that both parties contributed to this anti-Russian fervor. That is one way of justifying all this military spending. You have to create an enemy that doesn't really exist. You create in your own imagination and your own propaganda. Otherwise, there's no logic behind that level of military spending. China is more of is the other new threat is China, but China is emerging as an economic power. If it's a threat at all, it's more in the economic realm. China is not a very militaristic country. They fought very few wars, in the last decades. Once, I think, against Vietnam. Nothing to do with the United States. They have one military base overseas now. Then that was only in response to American, pivot to Asia and provocation. So it's very hard to make an argument that the U.S. actually faces any real national security threats. So you have to invent these threats to have and deceive the public into believing that there's any justification behind this huge military budget, new space command, while you're cutting social programs and making life very difficult for a huge percentage of your citizens.
Well, yeah, and it seems to me really that the whole demonization of Russia and of Putin personally, I mean, we always seem to demonize the leader, particularly in these countries, is primarily now a Democratic Party, ploy rather than one from the Republicans.
Absolutely, and that's why we have no real opposition. I mean, they claim to be the resistance, but they're misappropriating that term, kind of hijacking that term, because it's really elite interests who dislike Trump not for the right reasons. I think they dislike Trump because in some areas he has actually advocated for a more peaceful relation, like with Russia or North Korea. They don't seem to like that. So, that's the resistance, adopting further right-wing positions. And he's not hard-line enough on Russia, and he threatened to withhold aid to Ukraine, and that's why they're opposing him. And that's a fake resistance.
Oh, absolutely.
And no real opposition party to the misguided policies of Trump and neoliberalism.
Absolutely not. Yeah, there was one point in this speech I think that really underlined that for me. I'll give us a little sample of that.
My administration reversed the failing policies of the previous administration on Cuba. We are supporting the hopes of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to restore democracy. The United States is leading a 59-nation diplomatic coalition against the socialist dictator of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro is an illegitimate ruler, a tyrant who brutalizes his people, but Maduro's grip on tyranny will be smashed and broken. Here this evening is a very brave man who carries with him the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of all Venezuelans. Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido.
I thought that was sort of the low point of the speech for me.
Yeah. I mean, that's, really sad. I mean, Venezuela has had legitimate elections, and, I mean, the United States has supported some real true dictators around the world, including in Saudi Arabia is probably the most brutal regime in the world that the United States had feted with, huge arms sales. That regime not only brutally represses its own people, but has invaded Yemen and caused probably the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. In Rwanda and Uganda, the U.S. has supported dictators for life who've carried out mass killings and atrocities in the tens or hundreds of thousands. So, in Latin America, the U.S. has supported some terrible regimes like in Colombia and elsewhere. So, anybody who has a consciousness and awareness about global politics could see through the, clear vested political agenda that's at play there, and the desire to undermine the socialist government, which automatically makes a dictator I mean, Venezuela had a historic revolution under Hugo Chavez, where for the first time the government really was acting in the interests of the Venezuelan people. I mean, it's not a perfect government, but there have been significant improvements since Chavez took over and continued under Maduro to, take control over Venezuela's natural resources and to try and unify other Latin American countries to work towards the progress of their economies and prevent their exploitation from outside interests. So, but it's been subjected to demonization, attempted regime change. And Guaido, I think, has links to violent right-wing paramilitary organizations that were, for years, trying to sabotage the socialist government and were linked to atrocities in the streets. So to herald Guaido as this hero is ridiculous. And I think he was voted out of his position, if I'm not mistaken, as head of the parliament in Venezuela. He has very limited support in Venezuela. A tiny percentage of the population supports him. So that's not democratic. To support a guy who has 1 or maybe 5% support in the Venezuelan population doesn't amount to supporting a genuinely democratic leader.
Mm-hmm. No,
and I think even the New York Times was reporting that the Venezuelan people have rallied behind Maduro. I mean, he's endured an attempted regime change operation because many Venezuelans do support him and support the Bolivarian revolution that he represents.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely true. Unfortunately, this is the point at which Nancy Pelosi jumped out of her seat to applaud Guaido, and every Democrat stood up and applauded this fake president. Which
it's just a sad spectacle. And again, we have no real opposition party, and we have two pro-imperialistic parties, just who differ in their approach in some ways, but they're equally vile as the other. Many ways.
Yeah, it's really quite sad, and we're seeing right now in Bolivia another attempt. I think it has at this point succeeded. We're now seeing the purge of left-wing activists by the coup government in Bolivia. As they return to democracy, of course, according to the U.S., and we've already.
Yeah, where's the cry about human rights? From all these supposed champions of human rights, like Samantha or others, they never speak out against these kind of human rights abuses when it's against a left-wing leader. Mm-hmm. So there's such hypocrisy there that it's really sad that more people don't see it and call out these people. These kind of people are given prominent stature in our society, and they're just so hypocritical. Can make you sick.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was thinking about this earlier. You wrote a book on Obama's foreign policy, which I would say was not exactly complimentary of his. And as far as I can tell, every candidate for the Democratic nomination at this point wants to return to that policy, except perhaps Tulsi Gabbard, who, of course, is being, getting very, very little support and very little media coverage. But is that your assessment as well? Do you see any brighter light out there?
Well, yeah, certainly Tulsi Gabbard, I think, was pretty strongly opposing what she called regime change wars. She was also raising questions when she was in the debates about U.S. policy towards Russia and China, which I think was very, very positive to hear. Her vision, more cooperative world order between the major powers. And, I think she's called out some of this Russophobia. So I think she has a very progressive stance on foreign policy. But, yeah, we don't hear from her anymore. She basically barred from the debates, barred from CNN, smeared in the media, attacked by other Democrats. So that was a sad spectacle. The way Hillary Clinton went after her in Cold War terms, neo-McCarthy terms, as a Russian agent was really pathetic.
Yeah, really.
It shows the reactionary character of the Democratic mainstream. Bernie Sanders has at times adopted more progressive rhetoric and policies, so one could be maybe somewhat hopeful about him. Although on the negative side, I think Sanders and his camp kind of want to divide the world between authoritarians like Putin and Erdogan and pro-democracy forces. So that kind of rhetoric you hear coming out of the Sanders camp kind of is almost reminiscent of the Cold War rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So I'm a bit leery about his approach to foreign policy. I mean, in the past, he has adopted more progressive positions. Not always. He has supported certain wars, like in the Balkans and Libya, he should have opposed, and the drone war. Right. He supported the war in Afghanistan for many years, reading somewhere up until 2015. So he did oppose the Iraq war, but he should have opposed Afghanistan too. But he did, in the 80s, he had more progressive stance towards like the Sandinistas, and he was opposing the Contra War. I don't know his positions that well now on Latin America. One would hope they're better, given his background and more leftist movements and sympathy towards socialist ideals and movements. One would hope he might adopt a more progressive stance towards Latin America, but I'm not sure. I don't know exactly.
It's hard to know because that obviously is not the focus of his campaign. I mean, I have heard. I mean, the most positive thing I've heard is a lot of negativity about Maduro and calling him a dictator and so forth. But then, on the other hand, saying that the U.S. ought not to get involved in the affairs of other countries, or at least in that particular case. So that's an improvement. Could be better, but
yeah, it would be an improvement. The rest of the lot, I think, is just awful in the Democratic Party. From Biden, although Biden seems to be a sinking ship right now. So, but Buttigieg now may be the one to be leery about, because I think he's a very dangerous candidate who is maybe like an Obama with a kind of progressive liberal veneer, but is really backed by the big money power and could be a very dangerous president. Ill-qualified, given that he was only a small-town mayor. He really has no qualifications to be in that position in the first place. But I think if you look at who's supporting him, I think you would find it's a very dangerous candidate.
Absolutely, and interestingly enough, I mean, I saw a report just this morning on the Iowa caucus results that claims now that Buttigieg is the leader by 1%, but that he's still that he finished ahead of Bernie Sanders in the Iowa caucuses. Now, I think there's also enough. There's also enough news right now to cause me, at least, to be concerned that that's not an accurate count. And there's something clearly afoot here in terms of this app and the involvement of this consulting firm and all the stuff that's going on in the Iowa caucuses. Have you been following that as well?
Yeah, I would be suspicious like you. I mean, there's a lack of transparency in the whole process, and there's a history of the DNC trying to work against Sanders, who appears to have won clearly the popular vote, which the speech I heard Sanders gave was featured on Democracy Now! Sanders said, look, we got 6,000 more votes. Where I come from, that means we won, and I'd have to agree with him. I mean, he's clearly the popular choice, but they're going to try and rig the system against him, and they might have to, use unethical and illegal methods. I wouldn't put that past him. And I think if Biden's on a sinking ship, maybe now the powers that be are going to champion Buttigieg, who is, I think, again, a very dangerous corporatist, wolf in maybe sheep's clothing. And they might champion him as their boy against Sanders, and they'll do everything then to get him in and rig it against Sanders again, even though I think very clearly Sanders in this field is the most qualified. I mean, he's not perfect. Some of his things in foreign policy, as we said, could have been better, but a lot of his policies are quite good, and it would be a huge improvement to have him. And he's also qualified. He's been in the government for many years. He's kind of a solid person. He's not personally corrupt. And he does often follow through on what he says, so he's more trustworthy than any other candidate. And I think people in the electorate see that he's the best qualified person, and there's real momentum for a lot of the things he's pushing for, like in healthcare, writing off student debt, robust program to fight climate change. There's real broad support for these kind of policies. So I think he should be the natural winner, but I think what we see is that the DNC is a corrupt body that will do everything to prevent the true and best candidate from winning and challenging Trump.
Yeah, and I think we've got an especially difficult situation here this year in that we have the superdelegates out of the picture for the first ballot, at least, which is an improvement on 2016. But on the other hand, they're clearly going to pop right back in on the second ballot. And it seems to me the large field and the huge amounts of money being spent by Buttigieg and Bloomberg and Steyer and some others is really more designed to ensure that no one wins on the first ballot than it is. Yeah,
exactly. That's one way they may be trying to rig it, and somebody probably put up Bloomberg into investing his money so he could play that function, or as a backup to Biden, since Biden was shaky in the debates and appears to be starting to lose his mental edge and isn't as sharp as he once was. So they may have to drop him, and their choice will be the powers that be will either be Buttigieg or Bloomberg if he can make an ascendancy, or simply to stall the whole process so they can do something covert at the convention to get rid of Sanders.
Yeah. This reminds me. I mean, you're the historian, but this reminds me a lot of the, I think it was 1948 convention where Henry Wallace went in as the
1944,
clear choice. 40 what? 44 convention. Yeah, he came in as the clear favorite of the delegates, but didn't end up with the nomination.
Yeah, and that was, backdoor manipulations took place there. I mean, he was the favored, basically, it was almost like a given because he was the vice president under FDR, and FDR was sick, so everybody knew who the next vice president would be, the likely next president. And Wallace had been very successful and popular vice president, and had a very progressive outlook, especially on foreign affairs. I think actually was more progressive than Bernie Sanders. As we've said, Sanders has a lot of flaws in his approach to foreign policy. Wallace was really strongly in favor of cooperation with Russia. He favored supporting, and he was openly supporting progressive governments in Latin America. In fact, he had traveled. The book I read said that Wallace, pissed some people off, like in the British embassy, because he was supposed to attend some fancy function when he was traveling in Latin America, but he would actually just go visit with people to hear, about what was really going on in the country and what some of the problems were, and he was really genuinely concerned about them and wanted to do something for them to help the people. Like, he really cared about people. He was not just for his own political career. So he was really a special guy in that respect, and really the kind of person we would want as a leader. But, he was too progressive, too enlightened, and the bigwigs in the party at that time used, there was a blackout. Apparently what happened is that he was about to be renominated, and suddenly the lights went out, and then they had to stall the proceedings, and these party bigwigs then met, and, some money was traded, and through bribery, they nominated Harry Truman, who was a kind of a simpleton who had come up through the corrupt Pendergast political machine in the state of Missouri, and would do the bidding of the so-called military complex and party bigwigs who a lot of them came from Wall Street backgrounds or oil business, and they wanted more aggressive foreign policy. So they could, Truman was an easy guy to control, where Wallace had his own mind and was worldly and very progressive, but he was genuinely committed to world peace, Wallace. In fact, he wanted to cap military spending through the United Nations, close down overseas military bases, invest in nuclear abolish nuclear weapons, and use all nuclear material for civilian use. So he had a very, very progressive program. We haven't seen anything like that since, I don't think. And Sanders hasn't brought that up in the debate, the issue of the new nuclear arms race with Russia and how we can stop that. I mean, I haven't heard that out of Sanders. And his stance toward Russia is actually pretty regressive. So he's nowhere on the level of Wallace, but they still want to remove him. So he's enlightened a lot of domestic policies and would be a bit better in foreign policy.
Yes, and it strikes me there might be some parallels between Buttigieg and Truman as well.
Probably, yeah.
Which Buttigieg would probably like. You'd probably think that was a compliment. But
Buttigieg is very telegenic and I guess good looking, but he's just a front man for big money interests, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And to keep on the foreign relations thing a little bit, maybe we can switch over a little bit to talk about the impeachment or the acquittal, the failure of impeachment, however you want to talk about it, which was clearly a foreign policy centered impeachment. And maybe you have some thoughts about what happened and why it happened.
Sure. Well, firstly, I think the impeachment circus aids Trump significantly going into the 2020 election. As a political strategy, I think it was absolutely disastrous for the Democratic Party. And it makes you think, I mean, either they're grossly incompetent people managing that party, or there's some ulterior agenda, and that this was really designed to advance the new Cold War and war with Russia. Because why did they make that the centerpiece? I mean, Trump has done a lot of bad things in office, from pulling out of the Paris Climate Summit to this drone strike. I mean, that was completely illegal and unethical what he did to kill Soleimani, when even his administration could not produce any evidence to indicate Soleimani had committed a specific crime for which he should have been tried. I think that was an egregious violation of his office. Of course, Obama often did that as well. He killed many people through the drone program without producing evidence that they had committed any crime. So it wasn't unique of Trump, but it was an egregious abuse of his office. So if it was an authentic opposition party, they would be challenging these policies. And I don't know if that would be impeachable, because I'm not an expert on impeachment, but that's certainly something terrible they could call him out for, push for his impeachment. Whereas the thing they picked on was so minute that it's not going to convince the average American that what Trump did was so bad and necessitates his removal from office. And it may very well have been designed just to stir up more Russophobia and to provide a platform to attack Russia and to push for a harder line against Russia and more military aid to Ukraine. And it also kind of maybe sunk Biden's campaign, because Biden, what he did in Ukraine was much worse than Trump, with his son. And Biden openly bragged about forcing the removal of a prosecutor who was prosecuting his son's company for corruption and tax evasion, and the replacement of that prosecutor was himself very corrupt, who ended up replacing the prosecutor Biden had removed. So Biden was abetting corruption in the Ukraine. And, I mean, Trump, it was all ado about nothing, because that military aid eventually went through. The Trump allegedly withheld this military aid, but the military aid ended up going through. So if he was really blackmailing Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, why did the military aid go through? And there was never even an investigation of Biden, so it was all ado about nothing. And it makes you think that there's another agenda there.
Right. Yeah, I think there had to be another agenda, and certainly there's, to me, a big problem with the media coverage of this. I mean, we always have the media being, either blue media or red media, depending. But you ended up with this situation where every mention of Joe Biden in Ukraine and Hunter Biden in Ukraine was prefaced with the words debunked conspiracy theory, which in fact it wasn't necessarily, whereas the nobody debunked Adam Schiff, for example, saying that, we have to help the Ukrainians fight the Russians over there so that we don't have to fight them over here. I mean, which I thought was a completely ludicrous statement, but we didn't see much challenge of that in the media.
Absolutely, yeah. I had a piece on Counterpunch. It's only in the alternative media, antiwar.com. Published my piece, but I'd never be able to publish it in the Washington Post or New York Times or be invited on CNN. I was invited on Pacifica Radio after I published that piece. So it's only the alternative media that is open to any kind of challenge and open to the truth, because the fact is, like as I pointed out in my piece, is that my piece was titled "Truth is the First Casualty of the Impeachment Hearing." And that a lot of the statements Schiff made were simply false. Like he was claiming that the Russian the aid was designed to protect Ukrainians against the Russian onslaught, and the Russians had killed 13,000 people. That, in fact, the Ukrainian military had killed the majority of the people who were killed in the eastern Ukraine, and so and thousands of those killed were Russian-backed separatists. But he was insinuating the Russians then killed their own people. It makes no sense. It's just common sense that what he said was false, and the media fails to report. I mean, they're always attacking Trump, which often Trump deserves criticism, but you should be consistent. You can't. If Schiff is spewing nonsense, he has to be held to account as well, and that's a problem with this hyper-partisan media, as you say. Each media is just propaganda for its own side, and the truth is compromised. And many Americans, it becomes confusing. Like I teach, courses in college, and a lot of the students are confused. They really don't know who to believe, and they don't have the time to do a lot of reading. It really does require a lot of reading and outside research to really, get a grasp on what's going on and how misinformation is being purveyed on both sides. So if you don't have that time and you don't have a good background knowledge of American politics and history, you're kind of lost. And that's where I think a lot of students and young people are in all this.
Well, and I think a lot of their elders are as well. I mean, it's unfortunately, it's very, very easy to get propagandized by one side or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's very, very difficult to find out what's really going on in places like Ukraine or Venezuela or Iran or Iraq or even North Korea. I mean, you cannot really. It's very difficult to find the truth.
Exactly. So very few people, I think, and many people I spoke with who are, good people, and many dislike Trump, but they really don't know anything about Ukraine. So, like I was pointing out that, like just in conversations that, what they're saying about Russia is a bit misleading. I was trying to explain it, but they really didn't understand, and they knew nothing about Ukraine because there's been almost no reporting about it. And it's been a real humanitarian catastrophe there, and it's just gone completely overlooked. And it's American weapons that have been used to carry out most of the atrocity, just like with Saudi Arabia and the Yemen war, which has got a little more attention. And like some progressive, like Bernie Sanders, have tried to block aid to Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen, which is admirable. But those same progressive, like Sanders, have been silent about Ukraine. I mean, I think a progressive would oppose both the military aid to Saudi Arabia and Ukraine because they're both serving a nefarious purpose, being used by oppressive military forces to kill or displace innocent people. But it's only Saudi Arabia that progressive forces are opposing and have put some attention, not enough, but at least some. And like Sanders sponsored a bill to oppose that, but nothing, silence on Ukraine. That's shameful, yeah.
And of course, that bill went nowhere. And this is, I find, for example, in our congressional race here, our rather progressive congressman, he wants to do something about the War Powers Act or require the president to come to Congress to get authorization to make war against this or that country. And of course, I look at this and I say, well, can you imagine a situation in which Congress would not give him that authority? I cannot. It would rubber stamp anything of that nature, I think, right now.
Yeah, and I mean that's not a bad idea, but it should be combined with other things, and also, I mean, they're only bringing this up now because it's Trump. But what if a Democrat gets in? Because like with the war in Libya, Obama was abusing his executive power, and Congress, I believe, voted against the war in Libya. But the Obama administration ignored Congress and went ahead with the airstrikes in support of NATO. So where were these progressives and Democrats to oppose Obama's abuse of the War Powers Act and the atrocity that the U.S. was enabling by bombing Libya and overthrowing a leader who had a lot of legitimacy and support, Muammar Gaddafi, and whose ouster led the way to chaos and absolute catastrophe for Libya?
Right.
These progressives were not there to oppose that. So they should be consistent. I mean, personally, yeah, I'm in favor of the War Powers Act being strengthened. But if this congressman is only doing that because it's Trump violating it and not a Democrat, he's playing into this hyper-partisanship, and then the other side could attack him for his hypocrisy, and they have some resonance behind that. And that's how the Democrats lose a lot of people who agree with some of the Republican critiques, which unfortunately are true. So,
yeah, it really is. It's very difficult to, we have one party that is very clear about who they are and what they want, even though I find that detestable. The other party is, I think, if you ask the average person on the street what the Democratic Party stands for, they would hem and haw and scratch their head.
Yeah, and then they played up this identity politics and gender politics. Maybe they take it a little too far. I mean, I think it is good. We want more diversity in government and women's rights, but sometimes they take it too far. And that becomes the sole focus of everything, and they have to emphasize that he's gay, and it smacks some people who are more cultural conservatives. I mean, personally, I don't mind, but it does alienate cultural conservatives. And the Democrats used to be the party of the working people and working class in the era of Roosevelt, and that's when the party was successful, I think. And they alienate a lot of people by sometimes going too far, even like with this transgender stuff, they have to emphasize that. I mean, the transgender people is like tiny percentage of the population. So they make that into a huge political issue when it's really a very, again, limited population. And like with gay marriage, I mean, they make that like a centerpiece of their accomplishments with supporting gay marriage, but they're not actually helping working people. And gay marriage is more of a symbolic thing than anything else, and it's going to rub certain people who are religious or cultural conservatives the wrong way. So I have to question that as a political strategy.
Well, also it seems to me that all of this identity politics is really, in a sense, divisive. I mean, it separates us into smaller groups based on our personal attributes, and when the traditional left has been all about solidarity and finding common ground, with those who.
Exactly. Yeah. And also the working class, they've abandoned, they come across to many, like in Middle America, very elitist and looking down on people who are not Ivy League educated, and that's how they come across, and supporting these kind of narrow causes above the causes or things that matter to the majority of the American people, and that's not a good strategy for a political party.
No, it doesn't. I mean, there's something about calling a person a stupid deplorable that doesn't make them want to vote for you.
Exactly.
I don't understand.
Also, I mean, it's good to have more women, but not every woman is a good legislator, or so we want to have good people above all else. And we want a government that represents the diverse constituency. whatever, So that's most important than the gender or race of the candidate, because we have seen a lot of politicians who may be black or a woman who advance very bad policies. So that's not an improvement for anybody.
No, but it's a substitute for not having the policies that really are needed.
Exactly.
By those people. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I want to begin winding up here, and I think want to do that by maybe getting back to Trump. Unfortunately, he sort of ended his speech with a kind of ode to American history that I thought, as a history professor, you might have some thoughts about. I want to play a little bit of the last bit of the speech.
America is a land of heroes. This is a place where greatness is born, where destinies are forged, and where legends come to life. This is the home of Thomas Edison and Teddy Roosevelt. This is the home of Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Amelia Earhart, Harriet Tubman, the Wright brothers, Neil Armstrong, and so many more. This is the country where children learn names like Wyatt Earp, Davy Crockett, and Annie Oakley. This is the place where the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, and where Texas patriots made their last stand at the Alamo. The American nation was carved out of the vast frontier by the toughest, strongest, fiercest, and most determined men and women ever to walk on the face of the earth. Our ancestors braved the unknown, tamed the wilderness, settled the Wild West, lifted millions from poverty, disease, and hunger, vanquished tyranny and fascism, ushered the world to new heights of science and medicine, laid down the railroads, dug out the canals, raised up the skyscrapers, and ladies and gentlemen, our ancestors built the most exceptional republic ever to exist in all of human history, and we are making it greater than ever before.
So what do you think about that history, Jeremy?
Well, obviously it's a very selective history. I mean, words like taming the wilderness are not really politically correct anymore. And I think that's a good way. Our culture has evolved. The education system has taught the other side how the Native Americans were mistreated, and I think now students are learn to develop more sympathy for them and more tolerant approach than those generations which massacred the natives and carried out what many would consider genocide. So. It's obviously a very romanticized view of American history, and yes, there are great accomplishments of the country, but often it did come at the expense of whether slaves or native people. So, I guess some people want to believe a mythic history, and that would be Trump's base.
Right, and I think this whole exceptional country, the number one in the whole world, never before in human history, thing has huge implications for our foreign policy, and not positive ones actually.
Yeah, it fuels this kind of arrogance that we've seen in recent decades. That we're God's chosen people and we should go around the world, spreading democracy. And, we've seen how that's turned out in places like Iraq and Libya. So, yeah, I think it's very dangerous. Nationalism can often be a very dangerous force. I think history shows that. And I think America, like other powers, like Japan, World War II, or other countries like Germany, who became or were led by ultra-nationalistic leaders or forces, did some horrific things believing that they were on the side of rightness. And so it's a very dangerous mentality. And yeah, if you don't have a critical perspective on history, you can simply continue to repeat some of the major atrocities in different guises.
Right. Well, in all of the history or mythology, however you want to say it, that Trump was saying was really a history of white America, very clearly of white America. I mean, of course, he did refer to Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass at various points, but I think probably somebody inserted those in. And But yeah, I mean, this whole idea, I mean, the whole thrust of the speech there is really talking about how the white people conquered North America. It cannot resonate, I would think, for people of color.
Absolutely not. And that's why he is such a polarizing figure, because the United States has become a much more diverse country. And I think, since the 1960s, I think and Noam Chomsky has referred to the civilizing effect of the 60s movements with, I think, some justification. I mean, those movements didn't succeed politically in altering the political system, but they did transform the culture of the society in a much more liberal direction. And I think they changed the way schools are structured and the education system. And a lot of 60s activists became teachers or professors. So, students, again, now learn, more critical version of American history and learn to empathize with the Native Americans. And I think, people have more liberal value system in society in general today, and are more sensitive to atrocities that occurred, more aware about it and more sensitive to atrocities against the black people, the native groups. So I think that's why Trump arouses so much animus, because he's really a relic of an earlier generation, the pre-1960s mentality in the 1950s. And I don't think he's really a fit leader for our modern society. He wants to take us back to before the 60s, and I don't think we want to go back there. I mean, again, I think sometimes they push the identity politics too far, or in the wrong way. But I think our society is becoming more diverse, and I think that's a natural process, and people are more liberal and tolerant in their outlook, and want to be more inclusive, and see the history more critically. And that's why there have been a lot of protests like the monuments. A lot of people want these relics of the Confederacy to be removed. There have been protests like university. They don't want to honor Woodrow Wilson anymore because he was a racist. So it shows our society has changed, and we have a huge amount of the population has more critical view of our history, and we want to improve on that history and not go back to the darkest ages of our past. So
well, I hope we don't. I mean, obviously a certain proportion of our electorate is perfectly happy to do that, but just
and maybe less educate. Education is important, and I mean, I think Trump supporters may be less educated, or they may come from more rural areas that are less diverse. That is a huge gap you see in America between the cities, which are very diverse, and rural areas that may be more in favor of Trump, or whose worldview hasn't changed very much over the decades. And maybe also an older people are supporting Trump much more. I don't think his following among young people is that large.
To me, the biggest asset that Trump has is that we live in a really binary society politically. That there is no diversity in our politics. You are either this side or the other side, and when the other side is run, the other side actually is the Democrats are not adept really at putting forward a message and a policy platform that excites people in the country and makes us feel that we can move in a different direction that will be forward and progressive, but certainly does a lot of things that the Republicans can jump on and demean and attack.
Yeah, and they don't also have a counter narrative to Trump, something that could mobilize people and make people nostalgic. So that's problematic as well. But and for all their talk about diversity, their policies are not really actually reflecting that diversity. Their policies are not designed to assist more American, of lower income, which would be more minority groups. So that's part of their paradox as well, is that they want to be more diverse party. I put that in quotation marks, but that just means getting a few more black face in a position of power, but not really taking measures that will make the country more inclusive and make an economy that will work more for everybody and alleviate the plight of inner city blacks. And that's where they're failing.
Yeah, exactly. And Trump is clearly trying to draw attention to those failures and promise that he will be doing something about it, although chances are he won't.
And he gives the impression, the illusion he's doing something and he's restoring this heyday of the past, which is more of an illusion.
More of an illusion than anything else, especially for some people. But at any rate, I think we ought to wind up here. But I really appreciate it, Jeremy. I appreciate that you're taking the time to talk with me this morning.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Thanks again to Jeremy Kuzmarov for joining me this week on Wider View. As you've probably noticed by now, this podcast is a lot longer than the ones before it. Because I wanted to take this long interview and just give it to you, my podcast listeners, in its entirety. I will be making 2 shorter radio programs out of this, but that will be distributed over the Pacifica Network. So maybe you'll get a chance to hear those as well. Anyway, thank you for listening to Wider View.